When the land baron's men torched Mara Whitlock's barn and took the child she'd sworn to protect, the entire Montana territory expected the aging widow to finally break. They'd been waiting for it, watching her struggle alone on that failing ranch, counting down the days until grief and exhaustion would force her surrender. But standing in the ash-thick dawn with a rifle in her weathered hands and fury burning hotter than the flames behind her, 58-year-old Mara made a choice that would shake the valley to its foundations. She would not go quietly into the darkness they'd prepared for her. If you're ready to witness a story of courage that defies every expectation, stay with me until the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Mara's story travels across this world. The Montana wind cut through the valley like a knife through old leather, carrying the smell of coming snow and the particular kind of cold that settled into aging bones and refused to leave. Mara Whitlock stood at the fence line of her ranch, her hands wrapped tight around the weathered wood, feeling every one of her 58 years in the ache that ran from her shoulders down to her fingers. The sky overhead was the color of iron, heavy and threatening, and somewhere in the distance a hawk circled over land that had once been hers, but now felt like something she was merely borrowing on terms she couldn't quite meet. The ranch stretched out before her in all its brutal honesty. 300 acres of struggling grassland, a barn with a roof that needed repair before the first serious snow, fences that sagged like the hopes she'd been trying to hold upright since Thomas died. 6 months now. 6 months of waking alone in a bed that still smelled faintly of him. 6 months of doing the work that had once been split between two bodies, two sets of hands, two hearts that had beat in rhythm for 34 years. "You're looking at it like it's already gone," she muttered to herself, her voice rough from disuse. She'd gotten into the habit of talking aloud when no one was around, filling the silence that had become her constant companion. Like you've already lost. But hadn't she? The truth sat heavy in her chest, a weight she carried every morning when she rose before dawn and every night when she finally allowed herself to collapse into sleep. The cattle were down to 40 head from the 120 they'd had before the winter that took Thomas. The hay stores were low, the well on the eastern pasture had gone dry, and she didn't have the money to dig a new one. And her body, strong as it had once been, capable of working alongside her husband from sunup to sundown, now protested every task with sharp reminders that youth was a currency she'd spent long ago. The town knew it too. She'd seen it in their eyes during her last trip to Bennett's Creek, that particular mix of pity and impatience that people wore when they looked at something they considered already finished. Sam Garrett at the feed store had been kind but firm when he'd extended her credit one more time, his weathered face carefully neutral as he'd said, "Mara, you know I'm pulling for you, but winter's coming hard. Might be time to think about what comes next." What comes next? As if the answer was simple. As if she could just walk away from the land where she'd buried a stillborn daughter under the cottonwood tree, where she'd built a life from raw earth and stubborn hope, where Thomas's grave sat on the hill overlooking the valley he'd loved more than anything except her. Mara turned from the fence, her boots crunching on the frost-hard ground as she made her way back toward the house. It was a solid structure. Thomas had built it to last. Logs chinked tight against the wind, a stone fireplace that could heat the whole main room, windows that faced south to catch what winter sun the Montana sky was willing to offer. But it felt enormous now, full of empty spaces where laughter used to live, where the sound of her husband's footsteps had once marked the rhythm of their days. She was reaching for the door when she heard it, the faint creak of the gate at the end of the long drive that connected her ranch to the main road. Mara froze, her hand on the worn wood, every sense suddenly sharp. Visitors were rare out here, and the ones who came these days were rarely bringing good news. The sound came again, closer now. The slow, deliberate approach of someone on foot, accompanied by a lighter, quicker step. Mara moved to the window, her fingers automatically finding the rifle she kept propped against the wall. Through the wavy glass, she could see two figures making their way up the drive. A tall man walking with the careful gait of someone who'd been on the road too long, and beside him a small shape that had to be a child. Drifters. Her jaw tightened. The frontier was full of them, men displaced by war or bad luck, or their own poor choices, wandering from place to place looking for work that was never quite enough to put down roots. Thomas had always had a soft spot for them, would offer a meal and a night in the barn in exchange for a day's work. But Thomas was gone, and Mara was alone. and letting strangers onto her property when she had no husband to stand beside her was the kind of decision that could end badly in 100 different ways. But there was a child. Mara watched as they drew closer, details emerging from the gray afternoon light. The man was maybe 40, lean in the way of someone who'd gone hungry more often than not, with dark hair that needed cutting and a beard that was more necessity than choice. He wore a coat that had seen better years, patched at the elbows, and carried a worn canvas pack over one shoulder. But it was his eyes that caught her attention even from this distance, careful, assessing, but not hostile. The eyes of a man who'd learned to read situations quickly and adjust accordingly. The child beside him couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, a little girl in a dress that was too thin for the coming winter, with light brown hair that hung in 2 careful braids. She stayed close to the man's side, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch his coat, as if to reassure herself he was still there. They stopped at the porch steps, and the man removed his hat, revealing a face that was weathered but not unkind, marked by sun and wind, and the particular kind of exhaustion that came from carrying burdens that had no place to be set down. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and respectful. "Name's Silas Reed. This here is my daughter, Elsie. We've been on the road for a while now, and I was wondering if you might have any work that needs doing. I'm good with livestock, can repair most anything that's broken, and I don't ask for much, just meals and a place to sleep for me and the girl. We won't be any trouble." Mara studied them through the window, her finger resting against the rifle's stock but not yet committed to raising it. The smart thing would be to send them on their way. She had enough problems without adding 2 more mouths to feed, 2 more souls depending on her when she could barely keep herself afloat. But the girl shivered in the wind, and Mara saw how thin her coat was, how her small face was pinched with cold, and something deeper, a wariness that children shouldn't have to carry. And the man, despite his obvious need, stood with a dignity that spoke of better times, of a man who'd once had something to lose and had lost it. Against every bit of common sense she possessed, Mara opened the door. The cold rushed in like an unwelcome guest, and with it came the 2 strangers standing at the threshold with hope and uncertainty written in equal measure on their faces. Up close, Mara could see the dirt on their clothes, the wear on their boots, the way the girl's hands were red and chapped from cold. She could also see the muscle on Silas Reed's frame, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work, and the way he stood slightly in front of his daughter, protective, ready to move if this encounter went wrong. "You running from something?" Mara asked, her voice harder than she intended. "Law? Debts? A woman somewhere wondering where her husband went?" Silas met her eyes without flinching. "No, ma'am. I'm a widower, same as I suspect you are, if I'm reading the signs right. My wife passed 2 years back, fever took her quick. Lost our homestead in Kansas when I couldn't keep up with the work, and the banknote both. Been looking for steady work ever since, but most places don't want a man with a child in tow." His hand came to rest on Elsie's shoulder, gentle but firm. "I understand if you can't help. We'll move on, won't trouble you further." The girl looked up at Mara with eyes that were too old for her face, eyes that had already learned not to expect much from the world. And in that moment, Mara saw herself, not as she was now, but as she'd been at 8 years old, standing in front of strangers with her father after her mother died, hoping that someone, somewhere, would show them kindness. "Barn's out back," Mara said, the words coming out before she could stop them. "It's not warm, but it's dry, and there's hay for bedding. I'll bring you some blankets and food. In the morning, we'll talk about work." The relief that crossed Silas Reed's face was almost painful to witness. "Thank you, ma'am. We're grateful, more than I can say." "Don't thank me yet," Mara replied, already regretting the decision even as she committed to it. "You'll earn whatever you get here. This ranch doesn't run on charity." "Wouldn't expect it to," Silas said, settling his hat back on his head. He looked down at his daughter. "Say thank you to the lady, Elsie." "Thank you, ma'am," the girl whispered, her voice so quiet Mara almost didn't hear it. Mara watched them make their way toward the barn, the tall man and the small girl, their footsteps leaving impressions in the frost that would be gone by morning. She closed the door against the cold and leaned against it, her heart beating harder than it should have been from such a simple exchange. What had she just done? She was barely holding on as it was, and now she'd added 2 more people to her failing equation? Thomas would have done the same thing. She knew that with absolute certainty. But Thomas had strength she didn't have anymore, had options she'd run through months ago. But when she gathered blankets from the chest in the hallway and pulled together a meal of bread, cheese, and the last of yesterday's stew, she didn't let herself reconsider. She'd made the choice, and Mara Whitlock didn't go back on her word, not even when the word was given to strangers who might disappear with her blankets before morning. The barn was warmer than she expected when she pushed through the door, carrying a basket with the food and blankets draped over her arm. Silas had already started a small fire in the old stove at the far end, and Elsie sat close to it, her hands held out toward the heat. They both looked up when she entered, and again she saw that flicker of uncertainty, as if they expected her to have changed her mind. "Fire's a good idea," Mara said, setting down the basket. "Gets cold enough out here to freeze the breath in your lungs. These blankets are wool. They'll keep you warm enough if you stay close to the stove." "It's more than we've had in a while," Silas said quietly, taking the blankets from her and immediately wrapping one around his daughter's thin shoulders. "We won't forget this kindness." Mara waved off the gratitude, uncomfortable with the weight of it. "Like I said, you'll work for it. Ranch needs a lot of things done before winter sets in hard. Fences need mending, the barn roof needs patching, and I've got 40 head of cattle that need tending. If you're as capable as you say, there'll be plenty to keep you busy." "I am, ma'am. You'll see." She turned to leave, then paused, something making her look back at the girl who was already pulling bread from the basket with small, hungry hands. "What's your name again, child?" "Elsie," the girl said, glancing up briefly before returning her attention to the food. "Elsie Reed." "Well, Elsie Reed, that stew's better warm than cold. You and your father get some food in you and get some rest." Morning comes early on a ranch. Back in the house, Mara stood at the window and watched the light from the barn's small window, a yellow square in the gathering darkness. She felt the familiar ache of loneliness settle over her shoulders like a weight she'd grown used to carrying, but tonight there was something else mixed in with it, something that felt dangerously close to hope, and that scared her more than she wanted to admit. The next morning arrived with the kind of cold that made every breath visible and turned the water in the basin to ice. Mara rose in the dark as she always did, moving through the familiar routine of building up the fire, putting coffee on to boil, pulling on the layers of clothing that would keep her functional, if not comfortable, in the work ahead. She was surprised when she looked out the window and saw light already burning in the barn. More surprised when she stepped outside and found Silas Reed at the woodpile, his breath steaming in the frigid air as he split logs with steady, practiced strokes. He'd clearly been at it for a while. There was already a neat stack of split wood beside him, more than she usually managed in half a day. "You're up early," she called out, walking toward him. Silas paused, the axe held easy in his hands. "Habit," he said simply. "Figure I'd make myself useful right from the start." "Hope you don't mind." "Mind a man doing work that needs doing? That'd be foolish." Mara studied the woodpile, then looked at him. "You handle an axe like you've done it before." "Grew up in timber country in Oregon. My father was a logger before he took up farming. Some things you don't forget." He set the axe down and wiped his hands on his worn pants. "What would you have me work on today?" Mara considered, her mind running through the endless list of tasks that needed attention. Eastern fence lines in bad shape. Probably lose some cattle if we don't get it mended before they start wandering looking for better grass. It's hard work, cold work. "I've done harder," Silas said. "I'll need wire. Posts if you have them." "In the equipment shed. Take what you need." She hesitated, then added, "There's coffee on in the house. Bring your daughter up for some breakfast before you head out. No use working on an empty stomach." The surprise that crossed his face told her this was more than he'd expected. "That's generous of you, ma'am." "It's practical," Mara corrected, but her voice was softer than her words. "Can't have you collapsing from hunger in the middle of fixing my fences. That'd just make more work for me." A small smile tugged at the corner of Silas's mouth, the first she'd seen from him. "Wouldn't want to cause you inconvenience." When they came to the house 20 minutes later, Elsie walking close to her father's side, Mara had eggs and bacon frying on the stove and fresh bread sliced on the table. The girl's eyes went wide at the sight of so much food, and Mara felt something twist in her chest at the hunger she saw there. Not just physical hunger, but the deeper kind that came from going without for too long. "Sit," she said, more gruffly than she intended. "Food's better hot." They ate in relative silence. The kind that came from people who weren't yet comfortable enough with each other for conversation, but weren't hostile either. Mara found herself watching them when she thought they weren't looking. The way Silas cut his daughter's food into smaller pieces without being asked. The way Elsie ate with careful manners despite her obvious hunger. The way they communicated with small glances and gestures that spoke of a bond forged through shared hardship. "Your husband," Silas said eventually, his voice careful. "How long has he been gone?" 6 months, Mara replied, surprised at how easily the words came. Heart gave out while he was mending the south fence. Found him there at sundown, already cold. "I'm sorry, that's a hard way to lose someone." "Is there an easy way?" Mara asked, not unkindly. She poured more coffee into his cup. "Your wife, you said fever?" "Scarlet fever. Swept through our county like wildfire. Took her and half our neighbors in the span of 2 weeks. His hand found Elsie's shoulder again, that protective gesture that seemed instinctive. "Elsie got it too, but she fought through. She's stronger than she looks." The girl glanced up at her father, and Mara saw love there, fierce and uncomplicated, the kind that survived anything the world threw at it. She recognized it because she'd had it once, had known what it meant to look at someone and see your whole reason for continuing to draw breath. "Well," she said, clearing the plates with more noise than necessary to cover the emotion rising in her throat. "Fence won't mend itself. You know where the tools are." Silas stood, settling his hat on his head. He looked down at Elsie. "You stay here with Mrs. Whitlock. Help her with whatever she needs. Mind your manners." "I will, Papa," Elsie said softly. When he'd gone, the house fell into a different kind of silence, the kind that existed between a woman who'd forgotten how to be around children and a child who'd learned not to expect much from the world. Mara looked at the small girl sitting at her table, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast, and felt suddenly at a loss for what to do. "Can you wash dishes?" she finally asked. Elsie nodded. "Yes, ma'am. Mama taught me before she died." "Good. Then you can help me clean up here, and then I've got mending that needs doing. You know how to sew?" "A little, ma'am." "Well, you'll learn more today," Mara said, already gathering the dishes. "Frontier doesn't have much use for people who can't mend what's torn." They worked side by side through the morning, the older woman and the young girl, their hands busy with practical tasks that required no conversation. But as the sun climbed higher and the house warmed from the fire and their shared labor, Mara found herself noticing small things. The careful way Elsie dried each dish, the quiet concentration she brought to learning a mending stitch, the way her face relaxed slightly when she realized she wasn't going to be scolded or sent away. "You're good at this," Mara said, watching Elsie's small fingers work the needle through a torn shirt. "Your mother taught you well?" "She said a woman needed to know how to fix things," Elsie replied, her voice still soft but a little stronger than before. "Said the world breaks things all the time, and we have to be the ones who put them back together." Mara felt something catch in her throat. "Your mother was a smart woman." "I miss her," Elsie said simply, and the honesty of it, the lack of self-pity, just a statement of fact, hit Mara harder than tears would have. "I know you do, child. Missing people we love, that's just part of being human. Doesn't ever really go away, but it gets easier to carry after a while." Elsie looked up at her with those two old eyes. "Does it hurt you? Missing your husband?" The question was so direct, so unguarded, that Mara couldn't deflect it the way she usually did when people in town tried to offer sympathy. "Every day," she admitted. "But the hurt means he mattered, means what we had was real. I'd rather carry the hurt than forget what it felt like to have him beside me." They returned to their mending, but something had shifted between them. A small bridge built across the gap of stranger to stranger. By the time Silas returned at midday, cold and tired but satisfied, they'd mended 6 shirts, 2 pairs of pants, and a quilt that Mara had been putting off repairing for months. "Eastern fence is done," Silas reported, accepting the coffee Mara poured for him. "Found some weak spots in the northern section too while I was out there. Could tackle those this afternoon if you want." "How many posts did you replace?" Mara asked, genuinely curious. 12. Wire was worse than the posts in some places, had to splice in new sections every few yards. Mara did the math in her head, calculating how long that work should have taken versus how long Silas had actually been gone. He'd worked fast, far faster than she'd expected, and from the confidence in his voice, he'd done it right. "You weren't lying about being capable," she said. "No, ma'am. I don't lie about what I can do. Can't afford to. Reputation's about all a man in my position has left." Over the next 3 days, Silas Reed proved himself over and over again. He mended the rest of the fences, patched the barn roof with a skill that spoke of genuine carpentry knowledge, and took on the daily work of tending the cattle with the ease of someone who'd grown up around livestock. More than that, he brought order back to systems that had been slowly falling apart under Mara's solitary management, reorganizing the tack room, fixing the gate on the main corral that had been sticking for months, even cleaning out the well on the western pasture that Mara had assumed was a lost cause. And Elsie, quiet and careful, Elsie slowly began to bloom in the warmth of the ranch house. She helped Mara with cooking and cleaning, asked endless questions about the chickens and the barn cats, and occasionally forgot to be wary enough to smile. Small, tentative expressions that transformed her pinched face into something beautiful and heartbreaking at once. But while the ranch was recovering under new hands and new energy, the world beyond its borders was taking notice in ways that made Mara's survival instincts prickle with warning. It started small, a chance encounter in town when she went for supplies, pulling up to the feed store in the wagon with Silas driving and Elsie tucked between them on the seat. Sam Garrett had raised his eyebrows when he saw them, his weathered face carefully neutral as he loaded bags of grain into the wagon bed. "Hired some help, I see," he'd said, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. "Temporary," Mara had replied, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true anymore. "Just getting some work done before winter. Heard from the Wallace Ranch that you've been buying wire and posts. That's a lot of fencing work for temporary help." Mara had met his gaze steadily. "My fences needed mending. That a problem?" "Not for me," Sam had said, but there was something in his voice that suggested it might be a problem for someone else. That night, standing at her window and looking out over the ranch that was finally starting to look less like a failing enterprise and more like the home it had once been, Mara felt the first real stirrings of something she hadn't allowed herself in months. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could hold on to this place after all. She didn't yet know that others were watching too, and that hope, on the Montana frontier, could be a dangerous thing to let show. The trouble arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Silas and Elsie had come to stay, riding in on expensive horses that had no business on a working ranch. Mara was in the chicken coop gathering eggs when she heard the sound of hooves on the frozen ground, and something about the deliberate pace of their approach made her heart clench with instinctive wariness. She emerged from the coop to find 4 men dismounting in her yard, their clothes too fine for ranch work, their boots polished in a way that spoke of men who paid others to do their walking through mud. At the center of them stood a man she recognized immediately, though she'd only met him twice before. Clayton Voss, the largest landowner in 3 counties, a man whose wealth had been built on the bones of smaller ranchers who couldn't hold out against his patient, relentless pressure. "Mrs. Whitlock," Voss said, removing his hat with a courtesy that didn't reach his cold gray eyes. He was perhaps 50, well-fed and prosperous, with the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having been told no and meaning it. "I hope we're not disturbing you." "That depends on why you're here," Mara replied, setting down her basket of eggs and wiping her hands on her apron. She was acutely aware of how she must look. An aging woman in worn clothes, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple bun, her hands marked with the calluses and scars of hard work. Next to Voss's polished presence, she felt every one of her years. "Just a neighborly visit," Voss said, his smile showing white teeth. "Though I'll admit, I've been hearing interesting things about your ranch lately. Sam Garrett mentioned you've been buying supplies, making improvements. That's good to hear. Shows you're not ready to give up yet." The way he said "yet" made Mara's spine stiffen. "I wasn't aware my business was a topic of conversation in town." "Oh, everything's a topic in a small town like Bennett's Creek. You know that." Voss gestured toward the barn, where Silas had emerged, wiping his hands on a rag, his eyes cautious as he took in the visitors. "I see you've hired help. That's wise, though I imagine it's an expense you can't really afford right now." "My finances aren't your concern," Mara said flatly. "That's where you're wrong, Mrs. Whitlock." Voss's smile faded, replaced by something harder, more honest. Your situation very much concerns me. You see, you're sitting on water rights that I need for my operation. That eastern stream that runs through your property, it feeds into the valley where I'm expanding my herd. With the drought last summer and the dry winter we're facing, water's going to be the difference between thriving and surviving come spring. Then I suggest you pray for rain, Mara said. That water runs through my land, and it stays with my land. Voss sighed as if dealing with a particularly stubborn child. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer. More than generous, really, considering the state of your operation. $30,000 for the ranch, the water rights, everything. You could move to town, live comfortably for the rest of your years without breaking your back trying to hold on to something that's already slipping through your fingers. The number was staggering, far more than the ranch was worth on paper. But Mara heard what wasn't being said in that offer, that Voss knew she was struggling, knew she was vulnerable, and was betting that throwing money at an aging widow would be easier than whatever other methods he had at his disposal. This ranch isn't for sale, she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Not for $30,000, not for any amount. My husband and I built this place from nothing, and I'll die before I hand it over to a man like you. Something flickered in Voss's eyes. Anger, quickly controlled. A man like me? I'm a businessman, Mrs. Whitlock. I build empires, I create opportunities. What I don't do is let sentiment get in the way of progress. Then we understand each other perfectly, Mara replied. Because what I don't do is abandon what I love just because someone with more money thinks they deserve it more. The air between them crackled with tension. Voss replaced his hat, his movements deliberate. You're making a mistake. Winter's coming, you're not getting any younger, and that hired man of yours— His eyes flicked towards Silas with barely concealed contempt. He's not going to save this place. I'm offering you dignity, a way out before circumstances force a harder ending. I think it's time for you to leave, Mara said. Voss mounted his horse with the easy grace of a man who'd never had to struggle for anything in his life. He looked down at her from that height, his face cold now, all pretense of neighborliness abandoned. I always get what I want, Mrs. Whitlock, one way or another. The only variable is how much pain comes with it. Think about that when you're lying awake at night worrying about next year's taxes, about whether your cattle will make it through winter, about what happens when that old body of yours finally gives out. He wheeled his horse around, his men following, and they rode out as deliberately as they'd arrived, leaving Mara standing in her yard with rage and fear warring in her chest. Silas approached slowly, his eyes on the departing riders. That looked like trouble. That was trouble, Mara confirmed, her hands trembling slightly now that the confrontation was over. Clayton Voss doesn't make social calls. He came to test me, to see if I'd break easy. And did you? Silas asked quietly. Mara met his eyes, seeing the genuine concern there. What do you think? A small smile tugged at Silas's mouth. I think he picked the wrong woman to intimidate. Maybe, Mara said, but the fear was still there, cold and real. But he wasn't wrong about everything. Winter is coming, and I don't have much margin for error. One bad storm, one sick cow, one thing going wrong, and I'll be exactly where he wants me, desperate enough to take whatever he offers. Ooh, then we make sure nothing goes wrong, Silas said simply. We get this ranch as ready for winter as any place can be, and we show him that you're not alone anymore. The we in that sentence hit Mara with unexpected force. When had these strangers become part of her fight? When had she stopped thinking of them as temporary help and started seeing them as something more permanent, more essential? Why? She asked, the question coming out harsher than she intended. Why do you care what happens to this place? You barely know me. You could walk away tomorrow and find work somewhere else. Somewhere that doesn't have Clayton Voss circling like a vulture. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. 2 years ago, when I lost my homestead in Kansas, I went to the bank to beg for more time. The man who held my note, he looked at me the same way Voss just looked at you, like I was already finished, already gone, just too stupid to know it yet. He took my land, my home, everything my wife and I had built together. And he did it with a smile, talking about progress and business sense, while my daughter stood there watching her whole world disappear. His jaw tightened, old anger surfacing. I swore then that if I ever got the chance to stand against that kind of power, that kind of casual cruelty, I'd do it. So that's why I care, Mrs. Whitlock. Because watching you stand up to that man just now, that reminded me that some people still know how to fight. Mara felt something shift in her chest, a wall she'd built around herself since Thomas died, cracking just slightly. He'll come back, she said quietly. And next time he won't be polite. Then we'll be ready. Over the next 2 weeks, Silas proved those words weren't empty promise. He worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession, preparing the ranch for winter with the thoroughness of a man expecting a siege. Hay was moved from the far barn to the near one, stacked in careful rows that would be easier to access in deep snow. Every fence was walked, every weak post replaced, every strand of wire checked for tension. The cattle were moved to the southern pasture where the natural windbreak of hills would offer protection from the worst storms. And through it all, Elsie continued her quiet transformation from a wary, half-wild thing into something softer. She followed Mara through daily tasks with growing confidence, her questions becoming more frequent, her smiles less rare. She learned to make bread that rose properly, to mend with stitches so small they were nearly invisible, to read the weather and the color of the morning sky. One evening, as Mara taught her to knit by the fire, Elsie looked up from the tangle of yarn in her small hands and asked, "Do you think we'll stay here after winter?" The question caught Mara off guard. She'd been carefully not thinking about the future, about what would happen when the temporary arrangement with Silas became something that needed defining. "I don't know, child. That depends on a lot of things." "I hope we do," Elsie said softly. "I like it here. You're kind, even when you're trying not to be. And Papa, he's different here, less worried." Mara looked at the girl's bent head, at the careful concentration she brought to her knitting, and felt her heart constrict with an emotion she'd thought was buried with her stillborn daughter 30 years ago. "I like having you here too," she admitted. "House feels less empty with you in it." Elsie glanced up, her eyes suddenly bright. "Really?" "Really," Mara confirmed, and the smile that broke across the girl's face was worth every risk, every complication, every danger that came with caring about people again. But the danger was real, and it escalated faster than Mara had anticipated. It started small, a broken fence that let half the cattle wander into the hills, requiring 2 days of hard riding to round them up. Then the well on the western pasture was found filled with rocks, a malicious act that cost time and labor to repair. Sam Garrett at the feed store became suddenly unable to extend credit, his face apologetic but firm as he explained that circumstances had changed. "It's Voss," Silas said flatly one night as they sat at Mara's kitchen table reviewing their dwindling cash reserves. "He's putting pressure on anyone who does business with you, cutting off your supply lines, trying to isolate you." "I know," Mara replied, exhaustion heavy in her voice. She was so tired in a way that went beyond physical labor into something deeper, more fundamental. "But knowing doesn't give me options I don't have. Without credit, I can't buy feed. Without feed, I can't keep the cattle alive through winter. And without the cattle—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. "How much cash do you have left?" Silas asked. "Enough for maybe 6 weeks, if we're careful. After that—" Mara spread her hands on the worn wood of the table, looking at the veins standing out under age-spotted skin, at the permanent dirt under her nails that no amount of scrubbing could remove. "After that, Voss wins. Simple as that." "Nothing about this is simple," Silas said, anger threading through his voice. "He's trying to starve you out, and the town's letting him do it because they're too scared of crossing him. Can you blame them? Voss owns half the county one way or another. Going against him is economic suicide." "So what do we do?" Silas demanded. "Just sit here and wait for him to squeeze until you break?" Before Mara could answer, the sound of horses outside made them both freeze. It was full dark, well past the hour when honest visitors came calling, and the number of riders, Mara counted at least 6 horses by the sound, sent ice sliding down her spine. "Get Elsie," Mara said quietly, already moving toward the rifle she kept by the door. "Take her to the root cellar and stay there until I tell you it's safe." "I'm not leaving you alone to face—" "That's my daughter up there," Silas cut himself off, the raw fear in his voice making clear what he meant, even if the words weren't quite accurate. "If something happens to you while I'm hiding— If something happens to me and you're standing here, Elsie becomes an orphan," Mara said flatly. "You want to protect me? Protect her first. That's what matters." For a moment she thought he'd argue, But then he nodded once, sharp and military, and headed for the stairs. Mara heard his voice, low and urgent, and Elsie's sleepy reply, then footsteps heading toward the back of the house. She opened the door before they could knock, the rifle held low but ready, her finger near the trigger. On her porch stood 3 men she didn't recognize, ranch hands by the look of them, dressed for night riding, their faces hard in the lamplight spilling from her doorway. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Mara asked, her voice steady despite the fear hammering in her chest. The one in front, a thick-shouldered man with a scar across his left cheek, smiled without warmth. "Mr. Voss sent us with a message. Says to remind you that his offer won't stand forever. Says winter's coming fast, and it'd be a shame if anything happened to make it harder than it needs to be." "I already gave Mr. Voss my answer," Mara replied. "Nothing's changed." "See, that's the thing about circumstances," Scarface said, taking a step closer. "They have a way of changing whether you want them to or not. Accidents happen on ranches. Animals get spooked, barns catch fire, people get hurt when they're out alone in the dark." The threat was naked now, all pretense abandoned. Mara raised the rifle slightly, enough that the barrel pointed directly at the man's chest. "You're on my property uninvited, in the dark, making threats. Law's pretty clear about what I'm allowed to do in that situation." "Law's a long way from here, old woman," Scarface said, but he stopped advancing. "And accidents don't need witnesses to happen." "This conversation is over," Mara said. "Get off my land." For a tense moment, she thought they'd rush her. 3 men against 1 aging woman with a rifle. The math wasn't complicated. But then a voice came from the darkness beside the house. Quiet, but carrying clearly in the cold air. "She's got 1 shot," Silas said, stepping into the lamplight with his own rifle raised. "But I've got 6. And at this range, I won't miss. Question is, which 3 of you want to die tonight?" The men turned, reassessing the situation. Silas stood with the easy confidence of someone who'd handled a weapon before, who knew exactly what it meant to point a gun at another human being and was willing to follow through. "This isn't over," Scarface said, backing toward his horse. "Mr. Voss doesn't give up easy." "Neither do I," Mara replied. They rode out, and Mara didn't lower the rifle until the sound of hooves had faded completely into the night. Only then did she allow herself to shake, the trembling starting in her hands and spreading through her whole body, until she had to lean against the doorframe to stay upright. Silas was beside her in an instant, gently taking the rifle from her hands. "Are you all right?" "No," Mara said honestly. "I'm not all right. I'm terrified and angry and so damn tired I can barely think straight." "Come inside," Silas said, his hand on her elbow, surprisingly gentle. "I'll make coffee." In the kitchen, with lamplight pushing back the darkness and the familiar smells of coffee and wood smoke surrounding her, Mara felt some of the terror recede, leaving behind a core of pure fury. "He sent them to scare me, to show me he can reach me anytime he wants, that I'm not safe even in my own home." "It worked," Silas said quietly. "I was scared, and I'm not even the target." "Where's Elsie?" "Still in the cellar. I told her to stay put until I came for her." Mara nodded, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup Silas placed in front of her, seeking warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. "This is going to get worse. You know that, right? Voss isn't going to stop with threats. Men like him, when they don't get what they want, they take it, and anyone standing in the way becomes acceptable damage." "Then we get help," Silas said. "There have to be other ranchers in this valley who are tired of Voss pushing everyone around. If we can get them to stand together—" "They won't," Mara interrupted. "I know these people, Silas. They're good people, but they're scared people. They have families to feed, ranches to protect. Going up against Voss means risking everything, and most of them don't have enough to risk. So we do nothing? We just wait for him to burn us out, or worse?" Mara was quiet for a long moment, thinking. An idea was forming, dangerous and probably foolish, but it was the only card she had left to play. "No," she said finally. "We fight smart. Voss's strength is that everyone's afraid of him, that he can pressure people individually, and they'll fold. But what if we change the terms of the fight? What if we make it public, make it about more than just one widow's ranch?" "I'm not following," Silas said. "Bennett's Creek has a town council," Mara explained, her mind working faster now, pieces falling into place. "They meet once a month to discuss county business. The next meeting is in 4 days. What if I stand up in front of the whole town and tell them exactly what Voss is doing? The threats, the intimidation, the sabotage. Make him answer for it publicly. That's dangerous, Silas said slowly. You'll be painting a target on your back. The target's already there, Mara replied. At least this way, I get to choose the battlefield. And maybe, just maybe, if the whole town sees what he's doing, some of them will find their courage. Not all of them, probably not even most of them. But it only takes a few to make a stand. Silas studied her face in the lamplight, and Mara wondered what he saw there. The lines of age and worry, the exhaustion that had become her constant companion, or something else, something harder and more determined. You're braver than you think you are, he said quietly. I'm not brave, Mara corrected. I'm just out of other options. Brave would be having a choice and picking the hard path anyway. I'm just walking the only path left to me. That's exactly what brave is, Silas said. They sat in comfortable silence until Silas went to retrieve Elsie from the cellar. The girl emerged sleepy and confused, and Mara found herself gathering the child into a hug without thinking, feeling the small body relax against her in trust that was both humbling and terrifying. It's all right, she murmured into Elsie's hair. Everything's all right now. But even as she said the words, Mara knew they weren't true. Nothing was all right, and the storm that was coming would test everything she had left, her courage, her strength, and the fragile new family that had grown up in the spaces of her grief. The 4 days before the town council meeting passed in a blur of preparation and growing tension. Silas continued his work around the ranch, but now he moved with a watchfulness that hadn't been there before, his rifle always close at hand, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for trouble. Mara spent her evenings preparing what she would say, writing and rewriting her statement until the words felt both true and powerful. On the morning of the meeting, she stood in front of her mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. She'd put on her best dress, the black wool one she'd worn to Thomas's funeral, and pinned up her hair with the silver combs he'd given her on their 20th anniversary. She looked old and tired and scared, but she also looked determined, and that would have to be enough. You don't have to do this, Silas said as she came down the stairs. He and Elsie were already dressed for town, a united front whether she wanted it or not. Yes, I do, Mara replied, settling her shawl around her shoulders. This ranch, this life, it's all I have left of Thomas, of everything we built together. I won't give it up without a fight, and I won't go down silent. The ride to Bennett's Creek was cold and tense, the wagon rattling over frozen ruts while Elsie sat pressed between the two adults, her small hand occasionally reaching out to touch Mara's arm, as if to reassure herself they were all still there. The town hall was already crowded when they arrived, ranchers and townspeople filling the wooden benches, their voices creating a low murmur of conversation that died when Mara walked in. She felt their eyes on her, felt the weight of their judgment and speculation. There was Sam Garrett from the feed store, looking uncomfortable. There was Margaret Hendricks, who ran the boarding house, her face carefully neutral. And there, in the front row, was Clayton Voss himself, dressed in an expensive suit, his smile confident as he watched her take a seat near the back. The meeting followed its usual pattern: reports on road maintenance, discussion of the upcoming winter preparations, a debate about whether to hire a new deputy. Mara barely heard any of it, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone must be able to hear it. Finally, when the chairman asked if there was any new business, Mara stood, her legs trembling but holding. I have something to say, she announced, her voice carrying across the sudden silence. The chairman, an older man named Porter who owned the lumber mill, looked surprised but nodded. The floor recognizes Mrs. Whitlock. Mara moved to the front of the room, acutely aware of every eye on her, of Voss's amused expression, of Silas's tense support from where he sat with Elsie. She took a breath and began. 3 weeks ago, Clayton Voss came to my ranch and offered to buy my land and water rights. When I refused, he made it clear that my refusal wouldn't be the end of the matter. Since then, my ranch has been sabotaged. Fences cut, my well filled with rocks, my credit cut off at every store in town. And 4 nights ago, 3 men came to my house after dark to deliver threats on Mr. Voss's behalf. A rustle went through the crowd, people shifting uncomfortably. Voss's expression didn't change, but Mara saw his jaw tighten slightly. Now, I'm not a young woman anymore, Mara continued, and I know what some of you think when you look at me. You see someone who's past her prime, someone who should step aside and let younger, stronger people take over. But this ranch is my home. My husband and I built it from nothing, and I'll be damned if I let someone take it from me through intimidation and violence." "Mrs. Whitlock," Voss said, standing with the easy grace of a man used to commanding attention, "I think you're confused. I made you a generous business offer, nothing more. If you've been experiencing difficulties with your ranch, perhaps you should look to your own management rather than making wild accusations." "Wild accusations?" Mara's voice rose, anger burning through her nervousness. "The men who came to my house mentioned your name specifically, said you sent them with a message." "The imaginings of a frightened old woman," Voss said smoothly. "I understand you've been under a great deal of stress since your husband's death. Grief can make people see threats where none exist." The condescension in his tone, the casual dismissal of her words as the ravings of a mentally unstable widow, sent white-hot fury through Mara's veins. "I am not confused, and I am not imagining things. You want my water rights, and you're trying to force me off my land because I won't sell." "Do you have any proof of these claims?" the chairman asked, his tone careful. "Any witnesses besides yourself?" Mara's heart sank. She'd known this question would come, had known that her word alone might not be enough. "My hired man saw the 3 men. He can testify." "A drifter you hired 3 weeks ago?" Voss interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "A man with no ties to this community, no reputation we can verify. Forgive me if I don't find that particularly compelling." "I saw them too," a voice said from the back of the room, and everyone turned to see Sam Garrett standing, his face flushed but determined. "Not the night they came to her ranch, but I saw 3 men matching Mrs. Whitlock's description leaving Mr. Voss's office in town that same afternoon. I thought it was strange at the time, Voss hiring rough types like that, but I didn't think much of it until now." Voss's expression hardened. "Sam, you do well to be careful about the accusations you make. After all, your store does depend on the goodwill of your customers." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sam's face went pale, but he didn't sit down. "I'm just saying what I saw." "Anyone else have anything to add to this fantasy?" Voss asked, looking around the room. "Any other wild theories about threats that can't be proven?" The silence that followed was deafening. Mara felt hope draining away, replaced by bitter understanding that she'd miscalculated. Standing up to Voss publicly hadn't made her stronger. It had only shown everyone in town exactly how isolated she was, how few people were willing to stand with her when it actually mattered. But then Margaret Hendricks stood, her wrinkled face set in stubborn lines. "I've got something to say. Clayton Voss bought my boarding house mortgage from the bank 6 months ago. When I couldn't make a payment last month because my roof needed repairs, he offered to help by taking the property off my hands for less than half what it's worth. Said it was a kindness, giving me a way out before things got worse. That sound familiar to anyone?" Another hand went up, then another. One by one, people began to stand. Not everyone, not even most, but enough. A rancher from the next valley told about fences cut and cattle missing. A store owner spoke about sudden demands for old debts to be paid in full. A widow from the east side of town described an offer that was more threat than opportunity. Voss's face was stone now, all pretense of civility abandoned. "You're making a mistake, Webb," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "All of you. I've built half this county. I provide jobs. I bring money to this town. You go against me, and you'll learn exactly how much you need me." "Maybe we do need you," Mara said, finding her voice again. "But that doesn't give you the right to take what isn't yours. That doesn't make it acceptable to threaten people, to sabotage their livelihoods, to build an empire on fear." "This is absurd," Voss snapped, turning to the chairman. "Porter, you're going to let this circus continue? These are baseless accusations from people who are looking for someone to blame for their own failures." Porter looked uncomfortable, but there was something harder in his eyes now. "I think we've heard enough to warrant further investigation. I'm calling for a vote to have the county sheriff look into these allegations." "You'll regret this," Voss said, the words directed not at Porter, but at Mara. "All of you will regret this." He stalked out of the town hall, his boots echoing on the wooden floor, and Mara felt both triumph and terror warring in her chest. She'd done it. She'd made a stand, had gotten others to join her. But she'd also just made an enemy of the most powerful man in 3 counties, and the consequences of that were only beginning. As people filed out of the meeting, several stopped to speak to her. Quiet words of support, promises to watch their own properties for trouble, suggestions that maybe it was time for the smaller ranchers to stop competing and start cooperating. Mara accepted their support with gratitude and caution in equal measure, knowing that words spoken in the relative safety of a town hall might not translate to action when Voss's retaliation came. On the ride home, Silas was quiet beside her, his face thoughtful. Finally, as they turned onto the road that led to the ranch, he spoke. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the most foolish. Possibly both. Probably both, Mara agreed, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. But at least now he knows I won't go quietly. No, Silas said softly. Now he knows you're dangerous. And dangerous things need to be eliminated before they spread. The truth of that statement hung between them as the ranch came into view, and Mara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter wind cutting across the valley. The attack came exactly 1 week after the town hall meeting, in the dead hours between midnight and dawn when the world was at its coldest and darkest. Mara woke to the smell of smoke, acrid and wrong, cutting through the winter air like a blade. For a confused moment she thought she was dreaming, that her exhausted mind was playing tricks. But then she heard Silas shouting from outside, and the terrible crackling roar that could only mean one thing: fire. She was out of bed and running before conscious thought caught up, her nightgown streaming behind her as she burst through the front door into a scene from her worst nightmares. The barn was engulfed in flames, orange and yellow tongues licking up the sides of the structure Thomas had built with his own hands 20 years ago. The heat hit her like a physical blow even from 50 yards away, and the sound, the terrible, consuming sound of wood being devoured by flame, filled the night with horror. Silas was already there, his face lit by the hellish glow, trying desperately to force open the barn doors against the heat. "The horses!" he shouted when he saw her. "They're trapped inside!" Mara ran toward him, her bare feet slipping on the frozen ground, and together they managed to wrench the doors open just enough for the terrified animals to bolt through. 2 horses wild-eyed with panic, their coats singed, their screams of fear cutting through the roar of the flames. But there had been 3 horses in that barn, and even as Mara counted, she knew with sick certainty that one hadn't made it out. "The cattle!" Silas yelled over the noise. "They'll scatter if they panic." He was right. Already Mara could hear the sounds of the herd moving in the darkness, spooked by the fire and the smell of smoke, and if they stampeded into the hills in this cold, it would take days to round them up, days she couldn't afford, losses she couldn't absorb. But the barn was beyond saving now, the flames too hot and too high for any amount of water to make a difference, and all they could do was watch Thomas's work, her livelihood, her last reserves of feed and supplies, burn down to ash and cinders. "I'll handle the cattle," Silas said, already moving toward the corral. "You check the house. Make sure no sparks caught the roof." Mara wanted to argue, wanted to do something, anything, that felt like fighting back, but she knew he was right. She ran back toward the house, and that's when she saw it. The front door standing open, cold air rushing into the warmth they'd left behind, and the terrible gut-wrenching wrongness of a space that should have been occupied but felt empty. "Elsie!" The name tore from her throat as she took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The girl's small room at the top of the stairs was empty, the quilts thrown back. The window was open, cold wind billowing the curtains, and on the floor beneath it lay Elsie's rag doll, the one she never went anywhere without. Mara's legs gave out and she sat down hard on the floor, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. The open window, the abandoned doll, the silence where a child's breathing should have been. This wasn't an accident. The fire had been a distraction, a way to draw them out while someone came for the thing Voss knew would hurt them most. They'd taken Elsie. She didn't remember getting down the stairs or running back outside. She was simply there, grabbing Silas by the shoulders as he returned from settling the cattle, seeing her face and knowing immediately that something far worse than a burning barn had happened. "Where is she?" His voice was deadly quiet, more frightening than any shout. "Where's my daughter?" "Gone," Mara managed, the word like broken glass in her throat. "They took her. They came through the window while we were fighting the fire." Something happened to Silas's face then, a transformation that showed Mara the man he must have been before grief and hardship had worn him down. His eyes went flat and cold, his jaw set in a line that spoke of violence barely contained. Voss. We don't know. We know. Silas cut her off, his voice like iron. This is exactly what he threatened. This is him showing us what happens when we don't break on command. He turned toward the house, toward where his rifle leaned against the porch. I'm going to get her back. And if anyone tries to stop me, if anyone has hurt her— Wait, Mara said, her hand on his arm. Her mind was racing now, shock giving way to the cold calculation that had gotten her through 34 years on the frontier. If you ride onto Voss's property with a gun, you'll be dead before you get within sight of the house. He'll call it self-defense, say you were a madman attacking him, and Elsie will still be lost. Then what? Silas demanded, and she could hear the anguish under the anger, the terror of a father who'd already lost too much and couldn't bear to lose more. We just wait? We do nothing while she's out there, scared and alone? No, Mara said, an idea forming even as she spoke. We do what Voss doesn't expect. We make this so public, so witnessed, that he can't hide behind lies and intimidation. The town hall meeting proved people will stand up if they see a reason. Well, stealing a child— that's a reason that crosses every line, even for people too scared to act before. She was already moving back toward the house, her mind cataloging what they'd need. Get the wagon ready. We're going to Bennett's Creek right now, and we're going to wake up every person who stood with us at that meeting. We're going to gather witnesses, and we're going to march on Voss's ranch with enough people that he can't make us disappear without the whole county knowing exactly who's responsible. That could take hours, Silas protested. Hours when Elsie is leverage, Mara interrupted, hating the words even as she said them. Voss won't hurt her because she's only valuable if he can use her to control us. But if we go charging in alone, we lose that leverage and probably our lives. Trust me, Silas. This is how we get her back alive. He stared at her for a long moment, emotions warring across his face, then nodded once, sharp and final. We do this your way. But if it doesn't work, if anything happens to her because we waited, then I'll hand you the gun myself, Mara said. The ride to Bennett's Creek in the pre-dawn darkness was the longest of Mara's life. Behind them, the barn still burned, a pillar of smoke and flame marking the site of Voss's escalation. Beside her, Silas sat rigid with barely controlled fury. His hands clenched on the reins so tight she could see his knuckles white even in the darkness. They reached Sam Garrett's house first, and Mara pounded on the door with a desperation that brought the feed store owner stumbling out in his nightshirt, eyes bleary with sleep until he saw the wild look on Mara's face and the orange glow on the horizon behind them. They burned my barn, she said without preamble. And they took Silas's daughter, an 8-year-old girl, Sam. Voss has gone from threats to kidnapping, and if we don't stop him now, if we don't show him that some lines can't be crossed even for power and money— She didn't have to finish. Sam's face hardened, and he turned back into his house. Give me 5 minutes to dress. My sons will come too, and we'll stop at the Hendricks place on the way. Margaret's got a sharp tongue, and she's been waiting for an excuse to tell Voss exactly what she thinks of him. From there it spread like the fire that had taken Mara's barn, word passing from house to house as the sun began to lighten the eastern sky. By the time they assembled at the edge of town, there were 23 people on horses and in wagons, their faces set with the kind of determination that came from finally having enough, from seeing a line crossed that made cowardice more shameful than courage. Margaret Hendricks rode up beside Mara's wagon, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, and a shotgun across her lap. My granddaughter's about that age, she said simply. Some things are worth risking everything for. Porter from the lumber mill was there, and the ranchers who'd spoken up at the meeting, and several townspeople Mara barely knew, but who'd apparently heard enough to understand what this moment meant. Even the deputy, young Bill Carson, who everyone knew was more interested in avoiding trouble than causing it, sat on his horse looking nervous but resolute. This is it, Mara said to the assembled group, her voice carrying in the cold morning air. We ride to Voss's ranch, and we demand he return Elsie unharmed. We do it peacefully if he allows it, but we don't leave without that child. Everyone understand? A murmur of assent went through the group, and Mara felt something shift in her chest. She'd lived her whole adult life as one woman working beside one man to carve survival from hard ground. But this was something different. This was community forged in crisis, people choosing to stand together against power that had always seemed insurmountable. "Then let's ride," she said. Voss's ranch was everything Mara's wasn't: expansive, prosperous, maintained with the kind of resources that came from controlling half the county's land and water. The main house was a two-story structure of imported lumber and glass windows, surrounded by outbuildings that were larger and better kept than most people's homes. Corrals held hundreds of cattle, and everywhere were signs of wealth that seemed obscene when measured against the struggle required just to survive on the frontier. They rode up the long drive in formation, a ragged but determined line of horses and wagons, and Mara saw men emerging from the bunkhouse, Voss's hired hands gathering with rifles in response to the unexpected arrival. But they didn't advance, didn't raise their weapons, because 23 people were harder to intimidate than one widow and a drifter. Voss himself appeared on the wide porch of the main house, dressed despite the early hour, his face carefully composed but his eyes sharp with calculation as he took in the assembly before him. "This is quite the delegation," he said, his voice carrying the same smooth confidence he'd displayed at the town hall. "To what do I owe the honor?" "You know damn well why we're here," Silas called out, his voice raw with barely restrained violence. "You took my daughter. Return her now, unharmed, and maybe we can settle this without bloodshed." "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Voss replied, spreading his hands in a gesture of innocence that made Mara's blood boil. "I've been here all night. Perhaps you should check your facts before making wild accusations." "Your men burned my barn," Mara said, guiding her wagon forward until she was directly in front of the porch. "While we fought the fire, they climbed through a window and took an 8-year-old child from her bed. Don't pretend you don't know. Don't stand there and lie to our faces when we both know exactly what you've done." "Strong words," Voss said, "but without proof, that's all they are. Words from a desperate woman and her hired drifter, trying to blame their misfortunes on someone more successful." "Then you won't mind if we search your property," Deputy Carson said, his young voice unsteady but determined. "If the child isn't here, you've got nothing to hide." Voss's expression hardened. "This is private property, and I don't consent to any search. You want to come onto my land? You bring a warrant signed by a judge." "The nearest judge is 2 days' ride," Sam Garrett called out. "Convenient, that. 2 days for a little girl to disappear, for evidence to be hidden, for you to claim whatever story suits you best." "The law is the law," Voss replied, "even when it's inconvenient for an angry mob." "We're not a mob," Mara said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We're your neighbors. We're people you've squeezed and threatened and terrorized for years, and we're finally standing up to say enough. You want to hide behind the law? Fine. But everyone here knows what you've done, and everyone here is watching. If anything happens to that child, if she's found hurt or worse, there won't be enough law in all of Montana to protect you from the consequences." For the first time, Mara saw uncertainty flicker across Voss's face. He'd built his power on isolation, on keeping his victims separate and afraid. But faced with unified opposition, with witnesses who wouldn't be intimidated or bought off, his calculations were changing. "I think you should all leave," he said finally, "before someone does something they'll regret." "Not without Elsie," Silas said flatly. They stood in stalemate, two sides locked in opposition, and Mara felt the moment teetering on the edge of violence. Voss's men were armed, the townspeople were armed, and all it would take was one nervous finger on a trigger to turn this confrontation into a massacre. Then, from somewhere inside the house, came a sound that cut through everything else. A child's scream, high and terrified, and unmistakably Elsie's voice crying, "Papa!" Silas was off his horse and moving before anyone could stop him, his body a blur of desperate motion as he charged toward the house. Voss shouted something, his men raised their rifles, and Mara saw the whole thing about to explode into bloodshed that would solve nothing and destroy everything. "Wait!" The voice came from the side of the house, and everyone turned to see a woman emerging from the shadows, middle-aged, well-dressed, her face pale with what looked like genuine distress. "Clayton, stop this. Stop it right now." "Rachel, get back inside," Voss snapped. But the woman kept coming, and Mara realized this must be his wife, a figure she'd heard about but never seen. "I won't," Rachel Voss said, her voice shaking but firm. "I won't be part of this anymore. You told me you were teaching them a lesson, showing them who had the power. You didn't tell me you'd taken a child." A little girl who's done nothing to you, who you're using as a weapon against her father. This is business, Voss said, his voice tight with warning. Stay out of it. Business? Rachel's voice rose. This is cruelty. This is the act of a man who's forgotten. There are lines that shouldn't be crossed, not for money or land or power. She turned to face the assembled crowd, her eyes finding Silas. Your daughter is in the upstairs guest room, third door on the right. She's scared but unhurt. I made sure of that, whatever my husband's intentions were. Rachel, if you do this, Voss started, but his wife cut him off. You'll what? Threaten me the way you've threatened everyone else? I've stood beside you for 20 years, Clayton. I've looked the other way when you squeezed people out of their livelihoods, when you used fear and intimidation to build this empire. But this, taking a child from her bed, terrorizing a little girl to break her father, I won't stand beside you for that. I can't. The moment hung suspended, everyone frozen in the weight of Rachel Voss's defection. Then Silas was moving again, this time not charging but walking with deliberate purpose up the porch steps, past Voss, whose face had gone white with fury, through the front door that Rachel held open for him. Mara held her breath, counting the seconds until Silas emerged again. And when he did, he was carrying Elsie in his arms, the girl wrapped around him like she'd never let go, her face buried in his shoulder and her small body shaking with sobs of relief. She's safe, Silas called out, his voice breaking on the words. She's safe. The tension that had been wound tight as a spring in Mara's chest released all at once, leaving her shaking in the aftermath of terror and relief mixed together. But there was no time to process it, because Voss was moving now, his face a mask of rage, as he turned on his wife. You've just destroyed everything I've built, he hissed, his voice low but carrying clearly in the morning air. Every alliance, every deal, every ounce of respect, gone because you couldn't mind your own business. No, Clayton, Rachel said quietly. You destroyed it. You destroyed it the moment you decided power was worth more than decency. The moment you started treating people like obstacles instead of human beings. I just stopped pretending I didn't see it. Voss looked out at the crowd, at the 23 faces staring back at him with expressions ranging from disgust to fury to grim satisfaction, and Mara saw the exact moment he understood how completely the situation had shifted. He wasn't feared anymore. He was witnessed, exposed, his crimes laid bare in front of people who would never forget and never let the county forget. This isn't over, he said, the words directed at Mara. You think you've won something here? You've just made an enemy who has resources you can't imagine. Maybe, Mara replied, her voice steady, but I've also made allies. And I've learned something important. Together, we're stronger than any one man's money or threats. You built your empire on isolation and fear. We're building something different, something you can't break as easily. She turned her wagon around, the movement decisive, and one by one the others followed. As they rode back down Voss's drive, Mara looked back once to see him standing on his porch, his wife beside him, but separate now. Both of them watching the united front of their neighbors, riding away with the child he'd taken as leverage. The ride back to what remained of Mara's ranch was quieter, the adrenaline of confrontation giving way to exhaustion, and the realization of how close they'd come to violence that couldn't be undone. Elsie rode in Mara's wagon, still clinging to her father, who sat beside Mara with tears running unchecked down his weathered face. Thank you, he said quietly, the words inadequate for what had just happened but all he seemed capable of. Thank you for not letting me charge in alone, for knowing how to turn this around. You would have done the same for me, Mara replied, and knew it was true. When they reached the ranch, the barn was still smoldering, smoke rising from the blackened skeleton of timber and ash. Everything Mara had stored for winter, the hay, the tools, the feed, was gone, reduced to cinders and ruin. The loss was staggering, possibly insurmountable, and she felt the weight of it settle over her shoulders like a physical burden. But then Sam Garrett was there, walking through the wreckage with a practiced eye. Lumber mill can supply wood at cost, he said. My boys and I can help with the rebuilding, and I know others who will too. Margaret Hendricks nodded. I've got hay I can spare, and Porter's got lumber just sitting in his yard. We can get you back on your feet, Mara. That's what neighbors do. One by one, the others who'd ridden with them to Voss's ranch came forward with offers. Supplies, labor, resources that individually seemed small, but together added up to something that might actually be enough. Mara felt emotion closing her throat, making speech difficult. "I can't pay you back," she managed. "Not right away, maybe not for years." "We're not asking you to," Sam said gently. "You stood up when it counted. You showed us that fighting back was possible. Consider this us returning the favor." Over the following days, the ranch transformed from a site of devastation into something that looked like hope. Men came from neighboring spreads to help rebuild the barn, their hammers ringing out in rhythm that spoke of shared purpose. Women brought food and supplies, staying to help Mara and Elsie with the endless tasks of keeping a household running. Even young Deputy Carson rode out, his face serious as he recorded statements about the fire and the kidnapping, building a case against Voss that might not result in jail time, but would at least create an official record of his crimes. The new barn rose faster than Mara would have thought possible, the frame going up in 3 days, the roof and walls in another 4. It wasn't as large as what they'd lost, but it was solid and well built, and every nail driven was a small act of resistance against the man who'd tried to break them. Through it all, Silas worked like a man possessed, his guilt over Elsie's kidnapping driving him to labor that bordered on obsessive. But Mara also saw the change in him, the way he'd stopped looking at the ranch as temporary shelter and started treating it like home. He built a proper bunk area in the new barn without being asked, repaired parts of the fence that hadn't even been damaged, stayed up late sketching plans for improvements that would make the ranch more efficient, more sustainable. And Elsie, traumatized but resilient in the way of children who'd already survived too much loss, slowly returned to herself. She had nightmares that woke the house with her screams, moments of panic when Silas left her sight, but she also laughed again, helped Mara with cooking and mending, and gradually began to trust that this place might actually be safe. One evening, as Mara sat on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, Silas joined her, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He passed one to her and settled into the chair Thomas used to occupy, and for the first time since her husband's death, that didn't feel like a betrayal. "The ranch is in better shape than when I arrived," Silas said quietly. "With the new barn, the improved fencing, the community support, you've got a real chance of making it through winter now." "We've got a chance," Mara corrected. "None of this happens without you." "Still," Silas continued, his voice careful, "I've been thinking about the future, about what comes next for me and Elsie. We can't keep living in your barn forever, and I can't keep working for just room and board when you need hands you can actually afford to pay." Mara felt something clench in her chest, a fear she hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "Are you saying you're planning to leave?" "I'm saying I don't know what I'm planning," Silas admitted. 3 months ago, I was a drifter with no home and no prospects, trying to keep my daughter fed and safe. Now I've got something that feels like purpose again. But I can't assume that what I want is what you need." "What do you want?" Mara asked, turning to look at him in the fading light. Silas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I want to stay," he said finally. "I want to help you build this ranch into something that can last, something Elsie can grow up on, and maybe even inherit someday. I want—" He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "I want what you and your husband had, a partnership built on respect and shared work, on trusting someone to stand beside you when things get hard." "That's not a small thing to ask for," Mara said softly. "I know. And I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. But Mara, Mrs. Whitlock, you've shown me what it looks like to fight for something worth keeping. You've reminded me that there's dignity in standing your ground and refusing to let powerful men decide your worth. That's not something I'm willing to walk away from." Mara looked at the man beside her, seeing not a drifter or hired help, but someone who'd become essential to the functioning of her life, to the possibility of her future. And she thought about Thomas, about the life they'd built together, and knew with absolute certainty that he wouldn't want her to spend her remaining years alone and struggling when there was someone willing to share the load. "Stay," she said, the word simple but weighted with meaning. "Stay and help me run this ranch. Not as hired help, but as a partner. An equal stake in the work and the profits. A place for you and Elsie, as long as you want it." You mean that?" Silas asked, and she heard hope threaded through with disbelief in his voice. "I mean it," Mara confirmed. "This ranch needs more than one person to survive. And I need more than just survival. I need family, even if it's a family we're building from the pieces of our broken lives. Silas reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and calloused, the hand of a man who knew what it meant to work until your body gave out and then keep working anyway. Then we'll build it together, he said. Whatever comes next, whatever Voss throws at us, whatever challenges the frontier has waiting, we face it together. In the distance, Mara could see lights beginning to appear in the valley, lanterns being lit in the homes of neighbors who'd proven they could stand united when it mattered. The landscape that had seemed so lonely and hostile just months ago now looked like the foundation of something stronger, a community forged in resistance to cruelty and bound by mutual support. The war with Clayton Voss wasn't over. She knew that with cold certainty. But the terms had changed. She wasn't alone anymore, wasn't facing the future as one aging widow trying to hold on to memories. She was part of something larger now, something that had started with desperate resistance and was becoming genuine cooperation. Inside the house, Elsie called out asking if there were any cookies left, her voice carrying through the evening air with the casual confidence of a child who knew she was safe, who understood she was home. "We should go in," Mara said, standing and feeling the ache in her bones that never fully went away anymore. "Getting cold out here." Getting cold everywhere," Silas agreed, rising beside her. "But we've got a warm house, full stomachs, and each other. That's more than I've had in a long time." They walked inside together, into the warmth and light, into the evening routines of a family that looked nothing like what Mara had imagined when she'd stood at her husband's grave 6 months ago. But it was family nonetheless, built from need and choice and the stubborn refusal to let hardship win. And tomorrow they'd wake before dawn and do the work that needed doing, tending the ranch that had become more than land, more than water rights, more than property worth fighting over. It had become proof that survival was possible, even when the odds seemed impossible, that community could triumph over isolated power, and that sometimes the families that mattered most were the ones you chose rather than the ones you were born into. Winter came hard that year, settling over the Montana Valley like a judgment. The first major storm hit 2 weeks after the barn raising. 3 feet of snow in 24 hours that turned the landscape into an endless white expanse, broken only by the dark shapes of buildings and the skeletal fingers of bare trees reaching toward a gray sky. Mara stood at the window watching the snow fall, coffee warming her hands, and calculated how long their supplies would last if they got snowed in for weeks. Behind her, Elsie sat at the kitchen table practicing her letters, her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration as she copied from the primer Mara had found in the attic, the same book she'd used to teach herself reading 40 years ago when books were rarer than gold in the territories. The scratch of the girl's pencil on slate was a comfortable sound, domestic and ordinary, the kind of peace Mara had thought was lost to her forever. Silas came in from his morning check of the livestock, stamping snow from his boots and bringing with him a blast of cold air that made Elsie squeal in protest. "Cattle are holding up well," he reported, shrugging out of his heavy coat. "The windbreak we built is doing its job, but we're going to need to break ice on the water troughs twice a day in this cold." "I'll take the afternoon shift," Mara said. It had become their pattern over the past weeks, this division of labor that felt natural rather than forced. Silas handled the heavy work that her aging body struggled with, while Mara managed the household, kept the accounts, and used her knowledge of the land to guide their decisions. It wasn't the same as what she'd had with Thomas, but it was partnership nonetheless, built on mutual respect rather than romantic love. The knock at the door came just after noon, unexpected enough to make all 3 of them freeze. Visitors in this weather were rare, and after everything that had happened with Voss, unexpected arrivals carried an edge of danger. Silas reached for his rifle before opening the door, and Mara saw the tension in his shoulders ease only slightly when he recognized Sam Garrett standing on the porch, snow-covered and shivering. "Sam, get in here before you freeze," Mara said, already moving toward the stove to pour hot coffee. "What brings you out in this weather?" Sam accepted the coffee with grateful hands, waiting until feeling returned to his fingers before speaking. "Had to warn you. There's talk in town, and none of it good. Voss has been meeting with some lawyer from back east, fellow who specializes in water rights and land disputes. Word is they're building a case to take your water access through legal channels, claiming some old territorial law that gives priority to whoever can prove greatest economic benefit. Mara felt her stomach drop. Can he do that? The water runs through my property. Thomas filed the claim 30 years ago. Maybe he can. Maybe he can't, Sam said grimly. But he's got money for lawyers and time to let the case drag through courts while you're stuck trying to keep this place running. Even if you win eventually, the legal fees alone could break you. That's his new strategy, Silas said, his voice hard. Can't burn us out, can't intimidate us with the whole town watching, so he'll bleed us dry through the law. Make it so expensive to fight that we have no choice but to sell. There's more, Sam continued, looking uncomfortable. He's been buying up debts all over the county. Anyone who stood with you at his ranch, anyone who helped rebuild your barn, he's calling in their loans, demanding immediate payment. Some folks are going to lose everything if they can't come up with cash they don't have. The weight of that knowledge hit Mara like a physical blow. People had helped her, had risked Voss's wrath to stand beside her, and now they were paying the price for that courage. How many families? 7 that I know of for certain, probably more, Sam said. Margaret Hendricks got notice yesterday that her boarding house mortgage is due in full by the end of the month. Porter's lumber mill, the Wallace Ranch. He's going after anyone who showed you support. He's making an example, Mara said quietly, showing everyone what happens when you defy him, making sure no one else gets brave enough to stand up. It's working too, Sam admitted. People are scared. Some are angry at you for drawing his attention, saying you should have just taken his offer and saved everyone the trouble. The unfairness of it stung, but Mara understood the logic. Survival on the frontier meant choosing battles carefully, and she'd forced people into a war many of them hadn't wanted to fight. What do we do? She asked, directing the question to both men, but not really expecting an answer they didn't already know was impossible. We fight smarter, Silas said, his jaw set in the stubborn line she'd come to recognize. Voss thinks he can pick us off one by one, isolate us again through debt and legal pressure. So we do the opposite. We organize formally, create an alliance of the smaller ranchers that can pool resources and share the burden. A cooperative, Mara said slowly, the idea taking shape even as she spoke it. Like they have back east. Shared equipment, collective bargaining, mutual support when one ranch faces hardship. Exactly, Silas confirmed. Voss's power comes from being bigger than any individual operation. But if 10 ranches work together, share costs and labor and supplies, that's a force even he has to respect. Sam was nodding, his weathered face thoughtful. It could work, and it gives people a way to fight back without facing him alone. Strength in numbers, like at the town hall. It also makes us a bigger target, Mara pointed out. Right now, Voss is going after individuals. If we formalize an alliance, we become a direct threat to his control over the whole valley. We're already a threat, Silas said. He proved that when he burned your barn and took Elsie. This just gives us a better chance of surviving what comes next. Over the following week, despite the snow and cold, they began reaching out to neighboring ranches. Silas made the ride since his horse handled deep snow better, and his body could tolerate the brutal cold that came with winter travel. He'd return each evening half frozen, stamping feeling back into his feet, while reporting on conversations with cautious ranchers who wanted to believe in cooperation but had learned hard lessons about trust. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Porter from the lumber mill rode out himself one afternoon, his face grim but determined. "I've got the records," he said, spreading papers on Mara's kitchen table. "Copies of every debt Voss has bought up, every mortgage he's called in. Took some doing to get them, and the clerk who helped me is probably going to lose his job. But this..." He tapped the documents with a thick finger. "This shows the pattern. He's not just going after people who helped you. He's systematically trying to gain control of every property with water access in the valley." Mara studied the papers, her eyes scanning names and numbers that told a story of calculated acquisition. "He's building a monopoly. Control the water, control everything. Which means everyone with a stream or well on their property is at risk," Porter said. "Not just the people who stood with you. That changes the calculation for a lot of folks who've been sitting on the fence." He was right. When word spread about Voss's larger strategy, the resistance that had seemed to fragment after his retaliation began to coalesce again. Ranchers who'd been hesitant to join a cooperative suddenly saw it as their only defense against inevitable targeting. Within 2 weeks, they had commitments from 11 operations, representing roughly a third of the independent ranchers in the valley. They held their first formal meeting in Mara's house on a bitter February evening. The kitchen and front room packed with weather-beaten men and a few women who ran their own spreads. Mara looked around at the assembled faces, some friendly, some neutral, all marked by the particular wariness that came from years of frontier survival, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. "Thank you all for coming," she began, standing near the fireplace where everyone could see her. "I know what it costs some of you to be here, and I won't waste your time with pretty words. We're here because Clayton Voss has made it clear he won't stop until he controls every water source in this valley. Separately, we can't fight him. Together, we might have a chance." "Might isn't much to bet a ranch on," called out John Wallace, a grizzled rancher from the Eastern Valley. "What's this cooperative actually do besides put all our heads in one noose?" "It shares the burden," Silas answered, stepping forward. "You need lumber for repairs but can't afford porter's prices? The cooperative negotiates bulk rates. Your cattle need winter feed and you're running short? The cooperative maintains emergency stores that everyone contributes to and draws from as needed. Someone gets hit with a legal challenge or an unexpected expense? The cooperative helps cover costs so one bad break doesn't mean losing everything." "And who runs this cooperative?" another voice asked. "Who decides who gets help and who doesn't?" "We all do," Mara said firmly. "Equal vote for every ranch that joins, decisions made by majority. I'm not looking to be anyone's boss. I'm looking to survive, same as all of you." Margaret Hendricks spoke up from her seat near the window. "I've already lost my boarding house. Voss called in the mortgage and I couldn't pay. But I've still got my savings and I'm still here. I say we do this. I say we show that bastard that we're done being afraid." A murmur went through the room, agreement mixing with lingering uncertainty. They talked through details for hours, how to structure the organization, what resources each ranch could contribute, how to handle disputes, what to do if Voss escalated further. By the time people began leaving, trudging out into the snow toward horses and wagons, they had the framework of something that might actually work. "Think it'll hold?" Silas asked after the last guest had departed, helping Mara clean up the remains of coffee and the simple meal they'd served. "Has to," Mara replied, exhaustion heavy in her voice. "Because if it doesn't, we're all finished." But Voss wasn't idle while they organized. The legal challenge to Mara's water rights moved forward, filed in the territorial court with enough documentation and precedent cited that even Deputy Carson admitted it looked serious. The cooperative hired their own lawyer, a young man fresh from a Denver law office who charged less than the established firms but made up for inexperience with genuine outrage at what he called blatant monopolistic aggression. The case became this talk of the county, representing something larger than just one ranch's water access. It was about whether small operations could survive against concentrated wealth, whether community cooperation could stand against individual power. People who had no stake in the outcome followed the proceedings, taking sides based on their own experiences with men like Voss, their own fears about what the frontier was becoming. Through it all, the ranch work continued. Cattle needed tending regardless of legal battles, fences needed maintaining despite the cold, and life demanded attention even when larger forces threatened to sweep everything away. Mara found comfort in the daily routines, in the simple acts of survival that had sustained her through previous winters and would sustain her through this one. Elsie had become essential to that routine, her small hands surprisingly capable as she helped with cooking and cleaning, her quick mind absorbing everything Mara taught her about managing a household. The girl was changing too, filling out slightly as regular meals replaced the uncertainty of the road, her smile coming more easily, the nightmares becoming less frequent. One evening, as they worked side by side mending clothes, Elsie looked up from the shirt she was repairing. "Mrs. Whitlock, can I ask you something?" "Of course, child." "Are you going to marry my papa?" The question caught Mara completely off guard, her needle stilling mid-stitch. "What makes you ask that?" "You act like you're already married," Elsie said with the blunt honesty of children. "You work together. You talk about the ranch like it belongs to both of you. And at night when you think I'm asleep, sometimes I hear you talking in the kitchen like people do when they're planning a future together." Mara set down her mending, considering how to answer. "Your father and I are partners in running this ranch. That doesn't necessarily mean marriage." "But do you want to marry him?" Elsie pressed. "Because I think he wants to marry you. He looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama when he thought she wasn't watching." The revelation that Silas might have feelings beyond partnership sent something warm and terrifying through Mara's chest. She was 58 years old, well past the age where romance should factor into her life, and yet the idea of something more with Silas didn't feel wrong the way she'd expected it to. "I don't know what I want," Mara admitted. "Your father is a good man, and I've come to depend on him more than I expected. But marriage, that's complicated, especially at my age." "Mama used to say age is just a number," Elsie said softly. "She said what matters is whether someone makes you want to be alive for tomorrow, not just survive until tomorrow. Does Papa make you feel that way?" The wisdom in the question, coming from an 8-year-old child who'd already lost so much, brought tears to Mara's eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, he does." "Then maybe you should tell him that," Elsie said, returning to her mending as if she hadn't just cracked open something Mara had been carefully avoiding thinking about. But before Mara could process that conversation or decide what to do with it, everything changed again. The lawyer representing the cooperative rode out on a March morning when the snow was finally beginning to melt, his face grave as he dismounted. "We've got a problem," he said without preamble. "I've been going through the territorial land records trying to strengthen our case for the water rights, and I found something. Your original claim filing from 30 years ago, there's a discrepancy in the boundary description. A surveying error that means technically your property line is about 50 yards east of where you think it is." Mara felt the world tilt. "What does that mean?" "It means the stream doesn't actually run through your property," the lawyer said grimly. "It runs through what's technically unclaimed territorial land, which means Voss can file a claim on it himself, and there's nothing legally stopping him." "That's impossible," Silas said. "The stream's been part of this ranch since Thomas first settled here. Everyone knows that." "What everyone knows and what the legal records show are two different things," the lawyer replied. "And Voss has already figured this out. He filed a claim on that land yesterday. If it goes through, he'll control your water access. He can cut you off completely, and it'll all be perfectly legal." The implications crashed over Mara like a wave. Without water, the ranch was worthless. The cattle couldn't survive, crops couldn't grow, nothing could function. Everything she'd fought for, every stand she'd taken, would be meaningless if Voss could simply turn off her water supply through legal maneuvering. "There has to be something we can do," she said, hearing the desperation in her own voice. "Some way to challenge the claim, to prove continuous use, something." "There might be," the lawyer said carefully. "If we can find the original surveyor's notes, prove the error was his mistake and not your husband's, we might be able to argue adverse possession, that you've maintained and improved the property under a good faith belief in its boundaries for long enough that the legal description should be corrected to match reality." "The surveyor's been dead for 15 years, Mara said. "His notes could be anywhere or nowhere." "Then we find them," Silas said firmly. "We search every land office, every storage room, every place territorial records might be kept. This is our fight now. Not just for your ranch, but for every small operation that's vulnerable to this kind of legal warfare." The search became all-consuming. Silas and the young lawyer traveled to the territorial capital, spending days in dusty archives searching through decades of surveying records. Other cooperative members joined the effort, checking local offices and old storage facilities. Mara stayed behind to manage the ranch, her anxiety growing with each day that passed without news. It was Porter who finally found them, buried in a box of miscellaneous documents in the basement of the county clerk's office. The original surveyor's field notes, complete with sketches and measurements that clearly showed the error. The boundary had been transposed in the official filing, a simple clerical mistake that had taken 30 years to matter. "This proves it," the lawyer said, spreading the yellowed papers on Mara's table with something like reverence. "This proves your husband's claim was filed in good faith based on the surveyor's work, and that the error was administrative. Combined with 30 years of continuous occupation and improvement, we can challenge Voss's claim." But Voss wasn't finished. The night after the surveyor's notes were found, his men came again, not to burn or threaten, but to steal. They broke into the cooperative lawyer's office and took every document related to the case, including the original surveyor's notes. By the time anyone discovered the theft, the papers were gone, vanished as if they'd never existed. Mara stood in the ransacked office, looking at overturned files and broken locks, and felt something inside her crack. They'd been so close. For one brief moment, she'd thought they might actually win through legal means, might prove that right could triumph over power. And then Voss had simply taken that possibility away, proving once again that men with enough money could rewrite any rules that didn't suit them. "We still have our testimony," the lawyer said, trying to sound hopeful despite the devastation around them. "We can testify to what the documents showed." "Our word against his lawyers," Silas interrupted bitterly. "Without the physical evidence, it becomes a credibility battle, and Voss has spent decades building credibility while we're just desperate ranchers trying to save our land." "So we're finished," Mara said quietly. "He wins. After everything, he still wins." "No." The voice came from the doorway, and everyone turned to see Rachel Voss standing there, dressed simply in a traveling cloak, a leather satchel clutched in her hands. "No, he doesn't win. Not this time." She stepped into the office, her face pale but determined, and set the satchel on the desk. "I saw my husband's men return with these documents. I heard him laughing about how easy it was to eliminate the threat, how the law was just another tool to be manipulated by those with enough resources. And I realized that I couldn't stand beside him anymore, couldn't be complicit in what he's become." She opened the satchel, and Mara saw papers inside, the stolen surveyor's notes, along with other documents she didn't recognize. "These are the records he stole, plus something more. These are my husband's private accounts, showing every debt he's bought, every property he's acquired, every threatened payment and manipulation he's used to build his empire. It's all here, documented in his own hand." The lawyer was already reaching for the documents, his eyes wide. "Mrs. Voss, do you understand what you're doing? Testifying against your husband? Providing evidence of his crimes?" "I understand perfectly," Rachel interrupted. "I'm leaving him. I should have done it years ago, but I was afraid. Afraid of being alone. Afraid of losing the comfort and security his wealth provided. But watching what he did to you, to all of you, watching him terrorize a child, steal from people who'd done him no wrong, corrupt every system that's supposed to provide justice, I realized that security bought at that price isn't worth having." She looked at Mara, woman to woman, and there was something like kinship in her eyes. "You stood up to him when you had everything to lose. The least I can do is stand with you now that I finally found the courage to walk away." The documents Rachel provided changed everything. Not just the surveyor's notes, but evidence of systematic fraud, intimidation, and illegal land acquisition stretching back years. The territorial prosecutor, presented with proof that couldn't be ignored, opened a formal investigation into Voss's business practices. The cooperative's water rights case became secondary to larger questions about corruption and abuse of power. But Voss, cornered and facing real consequences for the first time in his life, didn't retreat quietly. He doubled down, using every remaining resource to fight the charges, to intimidate witnesses, to drag the process out in hopes that people would lose interest or courage. The investigation stretched through spring and into early summer. A grinding legal battle that consumed time and money the cooperative could barely afford. Through it all, Mara kept the ranch running, kept the cooperative functioning, kept showing up day after day to do the work that needed doing regardless of what happened in courtrooms and territorial offices. Silas was beside her every step, his partnership deepening into something neither of them quite named, but both understood. One evening in June, as they sat on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky, Silas finally spoke the words that had been building between them for months. "Marry me," he said quietly. "Not because it's practical or convenient, though it's both those things. Marry me because I want to build a life with you. Because I want to make this partnership permanent, because I love you in ways I didn't think I'd ever love anyone again." Mara looked at him, this man who'd arrived as a desperate drifter and become essential to everything she was and wanted to be. "I'm an old woman," she said, "set in my ways, stubborn, probably more trouble than I'm worth." "Yes, to all of that," Silas agreed, a smile tugging at his mouth. "And I'm a widower with a daughter, and a past full of failures, probably not the man you imagined spending your later years with. But we fit, Mara. We work. And that's rarer than you think." "Yes," Mara said, the words simple, but containing multitudes. "Yes, I'll marry you." They wed quietly a week later, standing before Porter, who'd gotten himself licensed as a justice of the peace for occasions exactly like this. Elsie stood beside them wearing a new dress Margaret had sewn, her smile bright enough to light the valley. The cooperative members came, and friends from town, and people who'd stood with them through everything that had happened. It wasn't the grand ceremony Mara had had with Thomas 34 years ago, but it felt right in ways that mattered more than spectacle. The territorial prosecutor's case against Voss concluded in late July with a judgment that sent shockwaves through the county. Massive fines, forced divestiture of properties acquired through fraud, and restrictions on his business practices that effectively broke his stranglehold on the valley. He didn't go to prison, men like Voss rarely did, but his empire was shattered, his reputation destroyed, his power reduced to a shadow of what it had been. The cooperative's water rights were confirmed, the boundary error corrected, and Mara's ranch, now Mara and Silas's ranch, secured against future legal challenges. But more than that, the smaller ranchers emerged from the battle stronger for having fought together. Their cooperative transformed from a desperate alliance into something that would outlast the crisis that created it. Standing on the porch of the house she'd shared first with Thomas and now with Silas, looking out over land that had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, Mara felt something settle in her chest that she finally recognized as peace. Not the peace of an easy life, the frontier would never offer that, but the peace of knowing she'd fought for what mattered and won, that she'd found family in unexpected places, that she'd proven to herself and everyone else that age and grief didn't have to mean surrender. Elsie called from inside, asking if there were cookies ready, and Silas laughed, the sound warm and comfortable in the summer evening. Mara turned toward the house, toward the life she'd rebuilt from ashes and stubborn hope, and knew that whatever challenges came next, she wouldn't face them alone. The summer that followed brought changes to the valley that would have seemed impossible just a year before. The cooperative that had been born from desperation grew into something more deliberate and lasting, with 12 ranches now working in concert to share equipment, negotiate better prices for supplies, and provide mutual support when individual operations faced hardship. What Voss had intended to be an empire built on fear had inadvertently created its opposite. A community strengthened by the very resistance he'd tried to crush. But not everyone was ready to accept the new order. Voss himself had retreated to what remained of his holdings, a bitter man watching his former dominion fragment into independent operations he could no longer control. His wife Rachel had filed for divorce and moved to Bennett's Creek, where she'd used her portion of the settlement to buy Margaret Hendrick's boarding house and restore it to profitability. The reversal of their fortunes, Rachel finding purpose and independence while Clayton nursed his wounded pride, was a story the valley told and retold, proof that power built on cruelty eventually consumed itself. Mara stood in the kitchen of the ranch house on an August morning, rolling dough for bread, while Elsie practiced her multiplication tables at the table. The girl was 10 now, taller and stronger than when she'd first arrived, her face losing the pinched wariness that had marked her early months on the ranch. She'd grown into the role of daughter as naturally as Mara had grown into the role of mother, filling spaces in each other's lives that grief had left hollow. "Mrs. Reed?" Elsie said, looking up from her slate. She still sometimes used the formal address, despite Mara's invitations to call her something more familiar, as if the girl needed the structure of propriety to feel secure in her place. "Yes, sweetheart? When the new families come for the cooperative meeting tonight, will there be other children?" There was hope threaded through the question, a longing that Mara recognized. Elsie had grown up in isolation, first on the road with her father, and then on a ranch where the nearest neighbor child was 3 miles away. "The Carmichael family has a daughter about your age," Mara said, dusting flour from her hands. "And I believe the Johnsons are bringing their 2 boys, though they're younger than you." Elsie's face brightened in a way that made Mara's heart ache with affection. "Maybe we could show them the kittens in the barn. The mama cat finally lets people near them now." "That sounds like a fine idea," Mara agreed. "But finish your lessons first. Education doesn't take a holiday just because we have company coming." The girl bent back over her slate, and Mara returned to her bread-making, feeling a contentment that still surprised her with its depth. Marriage to Silas had settled into a comfortable partnership marked by mutual respect and genuine affection. They shared a bed now, shared responsibilities and decisions, shared a future they were building together from the combined wreckage of their pasts. It wasn't the passionate romance of youth, both of them were too old and too scarred for that kind of intensity, but it was solid and sustaining in ways that mattered more. The sound of horses approaching drew Mara to the window. She recognized Sam Garrett's wagon, but beside him rode 2 people she didn't know. A young couple by the looks of them, their wagon loaded with belongings that suggested they were new to the territory. Silas emerged from the barn to greet them, and Mara watched through the window as introductions were made. The young man shook Silas's hand with the earnest enthusiasm of someone hoping to make a good impression, while the woman, barely more than a girl, really, couldn't be past 20, looked around at the ranch with wide, uncertain eyes. Mara wiped her hands on her apron and went out to join them, arriving just as Sam was explaining. This is Daniel and Catherine Miller. They came in on yesterday's stage from Ohio, looking to start their own homestead. I told them about the cooperative, thought maybe you could explain how it works. Daniel Miller had the soft hands of someone who'd never worked a ranch before, and his wife, Catherine, looked like a strong wind might blow her over, but there was determination in both their faces that Mara recognized. They reminded her of herself and Thomas all those years ago, young and hopeful and completely unprepared for how hard the frontier would be. Welcome to Montana, Mara said, shaking their hands. I'm Mara Reed, and this is my husband Silas. Come inside. We'll get you some coffee and talk about what you're getting yourselves into. Over coffee and fresh bread, the Millers explained their situation. Daniel's father had died and left them a small inheritance, enough to buy land and basic supplies, but not enough for the kind of established ranch that would generate immediate income. They'd come west with dreams of independence and prosperity, armed with optimism and very little practical knowledge. We've read books, Catherine said earnestly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. About ranching and farming, about what it takes to make a go of it out here. We know it won't be easy, but we're willing to work hard. Mara and Silas exchanged a glance, and she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Books couldn't prepare you for the reality of frontier life. The brutal winters, the isolation, the 1,000 small ways the land tested you every single day. These young people were going to struggle, possibly fail, unless someone helped them avoid the worst mistakes. The cooperative was started for people exactly like you, Mara said gently. New to the territory, limited resources, needing support to get established. We pool equipment and supplies, share knowledge and labor, help each other through the hard times. It's not charity. Everyone contributes what they can, whether that's money or work or expertise, but it means you don't have to face this alone. What's it cost to join? Daniel asked, and Mara heard the worry under his practical question. Money was clearly tight for them. $10 for the first year, then a percentage of your profits once you're established, Silas explained. And commitment to help other members when they need it, during harvest, during emergencies, whenever the call goes out. We can do that, Daniel said, looking at his wife for confirmation. Catherine nodded, though Mara saw uncertainty in her eyes. Before you decide, let me tell you what you're really signing up for, Mara said, her tone serious enough to make both young people focus. This valley has been through a war, not the kind fought with armies, but the kind fought in courtrooms and town halls, and through intimidation and fear. We won, but that victory made enemies. Some folks in the county still think we were wrong to stand up to Clayton Voss, think we caused trouble that could have been avoided. Joining the cooperative means aligning yourself with that fight, accepting that some people won't do business with you, that you might face resistance from quarters you don't expect. We're not afraid of making enemies if the cause is just, Daniel said with the confidence of someone who'd never actually had enemies before. You say that now, Silas said quietly, but talk to us after your first winter, after you've struggled through months of cold and isolation and work that breaks your back. Talk to us after someone in town refuses to extend you credit because you're associated with us. The frontier has a way of testing convictions that seem solid in comfortable moments. Catherine reached for her husband's hand, and Mara saw the young woman's fingers tighten around his. My mother told me not to come west, she said softly. Said it was too hard, too dangerous, that I'd regret leaving civilization behind. But I came anyway because I believe that some things are worth the risk. If you've built something here worth defending, something that helps people like us who are just starting out, then we want to be part of it. Mara felt something warm spread through her chest. These young people were naive and unprepared, but they had courage, and courage could be built on if it was properly supported. Then welcome to the cooperative, she said. Sam, can you take them out to the Henderson property? It's been sitting empty since old Jack died last winter, and his children back east were willing to sell for a reasonable price. Good water access, decent grazing land, needs work, but has solid bones. We could afford that? Daniel asked, hope and disbelief mixing in his voice. The cooperative bought it as a community property, Silas explained. We lease it to new members at cost until they can afford to buy in. Gives people like you a chance to establish yourselves without going into debt you can't manage. As Sam led the Millers back out to their wagon, Catherine turned and impulsively hugged Mara. Thank you, she whispered. You don't know what this means to us. Mara watched them drive away. The young couple's heads bent together in excited conversation and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. They would struggle, would make mistakes, would probably come close to failing multiple times. But they'd have support, would have people to turn to when things got hard, would have the benefit of collective experience to guide them through the worst pitfalls. We're building something that's going to outlast us, Silas said quietly, coming to stand beside her. Something bigger than just surviving another winter. I know, Mara replied, leaning into his solid presence. Sometimes it scares me how much people depend on this working. What happens if we fail them? Then we fail together, Silas said simply. But we won't. Look at what we've already survived, what we've already built. We're not those desperate people fighting for our lives anymore. We're something stronger now. That evening, the ranch yard filled with wagons and horses as cooperative members arrived for their monthly meeting. It had become a social occasion as much as a business one, families gathering to share news and food, children playing in the yard while adults discussed crop rotation and equipment sharing and which members needed extra support. Mara moved through the crowd with Elsie at her side, greeting neighbors who'd become friends, watching with satisfaction as the community they'd built from necessity evolved into something more organic and enduring. The meeting itself was held in the new barn, members sitting on hay bales while Porter, who'd been elected cooperative chairman, reviewed the month's business. Finances were discussed, work schedules coordinated, disputes arbitrated with fairness that came from everyone having a stake in maintaining harmony. It wasn't perfect. There were disagreements and tensions, personality conflicts that had to be managed, but it functioned, and that alone felt like a minor miracle. When the formal business concluded, Margaret Hendricks stood to speak, her weathered face serious. I've got something that needs addressing. There's talk in town that Voss is planning to sell what's left of his holdings and leave the territory. Some of the merchants are worried about losing business, saying we should make peace with him, maybe even invite him to join the cooperative. The suggestion sent a ripple of reaction through the assembled members, voices rising in protest and discussion. Mara felt Silas tense beside her, his jaw tightening with old anger. He burned my barn, Mara said, her voice cutting through the noise. He kidnapped a child. He terrorized this whole valley for years, and now that he's facing consequences, we're supposed to forgive and forget? Invite him into the organization we built specifically to protect ourselves from men like him? I'm not saying forgive, Margaret clarified. I'm saying we need to decide who we want to be. Are we the cooperative that stands for mutual support and second chances? Or are we the cooperative that exists primarily to oppose Clayton Voss? Because if it's the latter, then what happens when he's gone? Do we lose our purpose? The question hung in the air, forcing everyone to confront something they'd been avoiding. The cooperative had been born from resistance, but it couldn't survive on opposition alone. It needed a positive vision, a reason to exist beyond fighting a common enemy. I think, a voice said from the back, and everyone turned to see Rachel Voss standing in the barn doorway, that you need to decide what kind of community you want to build. My husband did terrible things. He hurt people, abused power, built an empire on fear and intimidation. But he's a broken man now, stripped of everything he built his identity on. The question isn't whether he deserves your forgiveness. That's between each of you and your own conscience. The question is whether you want to be the kind of community that makes room for redemption, even for people who seem beyond it. You're asking us to let him join? Porter asked, his voice carefully neutral. I'm asking you to think about what values you want your cooperative to embody, Rachel replied. Mercy or justice? Forgiveness or accountability? Maybe some combination of both. But make that decision based on who you want to be, not on what he did to you. The debate that followed was heated, passionate voices on both sides arguing positions that seemed irreconcilable. Some members felt that denying Voss entry would make them no better than he'd been, using exclusion as a weapon. Others argued that joining the cooperative required a level of trust Voss had destroyed beyond any possibility of repair, that protecting the community's safety meant keeping out people who'd proven themselves dangerous. Mara listened to it all, her own emotions churning. Part of her wanted to stand up and declare that Voss would never be welcome, that some betrayals were too deep to forgive. But another part, the part that had learned over the past year that community required compromise and grace, recognized that Rachel had raised a legitimate question about who they wanted to be. Finally, she stood, and the room quieted to hear what she would say. "I'm the person who has the most right to say no," she began, her voice steady. "He targeted me specifically, destroyed my property, put people I love in danger. If anyone gets to refuse him entry, it's me." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But I'm also the person who understands most clearly what this cooperative is supposed to stand for. When Silas and Elsie showed up at my gate last year, I had every reason to turn them away. They were strangers. They were a burden I couldn't afford. They were a complication in a life that was already failing. But I let them stay, and that decision saved me in ways I couldn't have predicted." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of people who'd become more than neighbors, who'd become family forged in shared struggle. "I don't know if Clayton Voss deserves a second chance. That's not for me to decide. But I know that this cooperative was built on the principle that everyone deserves support, that we're stronger together than apart. That community means making room for people even when it's inconvenient or uncomfortable. If we abandon that principle for one person, no matter how much he's hurt us, then we're saying our values only matter when they're easy to uphold." "So you're saying we should let him join?" someone called out. "I'm saying we should make a decision based on our principles, not on our anger," Mara replied. "If our rule is that membership is open to anyone willing to contribute and uphold our values, then that has to apply to everyone. But if he joins, it's with clear expectations. He contributes equally. He follows our decisions. He treats every member with respect. The moment he violates those terms, he's out. No second chances after the second chance." The vote, when it came, was close. 14 in favor of allowing Voss to apply for membership if he chose, 9 against. It wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive enough to stand. Whether Voss would actually join remained to be seen, but the cooperative had made a statement about who they were and what they stood for. After the meeting, as families dispersed into the summer night, Silas found Mara standing alone near the fence line, looking out over the dark valley. "That was brave," he said quietly. "Also possibly foolish, but definitely brave." "I don't know if it was the right decision," Mara admitted. "I don't know if I can actually work beside him after everything he's done." "You don't have to know right now," Silas said, his hand finding hers. "We face that if and when it happens. But what you did tonight, choosing principle over revenge, showing everyone that we're building something bigger than our individual hurts, that matters. That's leadership." "I'm not a leader," Mara protested. "I'm just an old woman trying to hold on to her ranch." "You're a woman who refused to break when breaking would have been easier," Silas corrected. "A woman who built a community from the ashes of her barn, who showed people that standing together was possible. That's not just holding on to a ranch. That's changing how an entire valley thinks about power and cooperation." Mara leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. In the distance, she could see the lights of other ranches scattered across the valley, each one representing a family that was part of the network they'd built. The cooperative wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and sometimes frustratingly difficult, but it was real, and it was working. The months that followed brought their own challenges and rewards. The Millers struggled exactly as Mara had predicted, making mistakes that would have been catastrophic without the cooperative's support. Their first attempt at building a fence collapsed in a windstorm. Their inexperience with cattle led to several animals wandering off, and Catherine nearly poisoned herself trying to prepare unfamiliar wild greens for dinner. But each crisis became a teaching moment, cooperative members taking turns riding out to help, to show, to encourage. Voss never did apply for membership. Instead, he sold his remaining holdings to a land company from back east and disappeared from the territory entirely, leaving behind only stories and the changes his presence had forced. Rachel stayed, becoming one of the cooperative's most reliable members, her business acumen and organizational skills proving invaluable as the group grew and formalized its operations. By the time winter came again, the second winter since Silas and Elsie had arrived, the valley had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The cooperative had grown to 18-member ranches, with 3 more in the application process. A shared equipment pool meant that expensive tools were accessible to everyone, maintained communally, and allocated based on need rather than individual ownership. A cooperative store had opened in Bennett's Creek, offering members better prices and credit terms than the established merchants, forcing competition that benefited everyone. But the real changes were harder to quantify. There was a different feeling in the valley now, a sense that people looked out for each other, that success didn't require someone else's failure, that community was something you built deliberately rather than something that happened by accident. Children played together at cooperative gatherings, families shared holidays and celebrations, and the isolation that had once defined frontier life gave way to something richer and more connected. Mara stood in her kitchen on a December evening, preparing dinner for a house that now regularly held more people than she'd ever imagined feeding. Elsie was at the table with the Carmichael girl, both of them bent over a book of poetry Mara had ordered from a Denver catalog. Silas was in the front room with Daniel Miller discussing plans for spring planting. And in the corner, sleeping peacefully in a cradle that had been built by Porter's skilled hands, was the newest addition to their family. A son born 3 months ago, named Thomas after the husband Mara had lost but never forgotten. The baby had been a surprise, a development Mara had thought impossible at her age. The pregnancy had been difficult, the birth even more so, and there had been moments when she genuinely feared she wouldn't survive it. But she had, and Silas had a son, and Elsie had a brother, and the ranch had an heir who would grow up knowing he was born into a family and a community that would support him no matter what challenges came. Mrs. Reed, when you were young, did you ever imagine your life would turn out like this? Elsie asked, looking up from her book with the thoughtful expression that meant she'd been working up to a serious question. Mara considered, her hands stilling in their work. No, she said honestly. When I was your age, I imagined I'd marry a farmer, have children, live a quiet life. I didn't imagine losing a baby, or building a ranch from scratch, or burying a husband I loved. I certainly didn't imagine getting remarried at 58, or helping build a cooperative, or having a baby at an age when most women are grandmothers. Do you wish it had been different? Elsie pressed. Easier? Sometimes, Mara admitted. Usually when my back hurts or I'm so tired I can barely stand. But then I look at what we've built, this family, this community, this life that matters beyond just our own survival. And I think that maybe the hard path was the right one after all. Because if everything had been easy, I would have stayed comfortable and never discovered how strong I actually am. The girl nodded, returning to her book, but Mara could see the wheels turning in her young mind. Elsie was growing into someone remarkable, combining her father's quiet strength with something uniquely her own, a sharp intelligence and a capacity for empathy that suggested she'd do great things someday. Dinner that evening was loud and chaotic, the table crowded with people and conversation flowing in multiple directions at once. Daniel asked questions about cattle breeding, while Catherine discussed preserving techniques with Elsie. Silas held baby Thomas, bouncing him gently while explaining to the Carmichael girl why her father's fence design would work better with a different post spacing. It was messy and sometimes overwhelming, but it was also vibrantly, wonderfully alive. After everyone had gone home and the house had settled into quiet, Mara and Silas sat together in front of the fire, the baby asleep in his cradle nearby. Mara's body ached with the particular exhaustion of a full day's work, but it was the satisfied ache of effort well spent. We did it, she said softly. We actually survived and built something worth having. We're still building, Silas corrected gently. This isn't an ending. It's just the foundation. I know, Mara said, but it's a good foundation, strong enough to support whatever comes next. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, from a desperate widow facing the loss of everything, to a woman at the center of a thriving community, to a mother again when she'd thought that chapter of her life was closed forever. It had been brutal and terrifying and harder than anything she'd ever imagined, but it had also been worth it. The frontier had tested her in every way possible, had stripped away everything she thought she knew about herself and forced her to discover reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. It had shown her that age didn't mean obsolescence, that loss didn't mean ending, that one person's courage could inspire others to find their own. And now, sitting in a house filled with the evidence of survival, the sleeping baby, the husband beside her, the daughter upstairs, The cooperative that extended beyond these walls to encompass dozens of families working together. Mara understood that her greatest victory hadn't been defeating Clayton Voss or saving her ranch. It had been refusing to accept the world's verdict that she was finished, that her time was over, that an aging widow had nothing left to contribute. She'd proven them all wrong, had shown that endurance could be more powerful than youth, that wisdom earned through suffering had its own kind of strength, that community built on mutual support could triumph over individual power. She'd created a legacy that would outlast her, a cooperative that would help families she'd never meet, a model for how people could choose to treat each other even in circumstances that made cruelty seem easier. Spring would come again, and with it, new challenges and new opportunities. The cooperative would grow, some members would struggle while others thrived, and the work of building something lasting would continue. But for now, in this moment, Mara allowed herself to simply be, to exist in the warmth of her home, surrounded by people she loved, knowing that she'd fought for what mattered and won. "What are you thinking?" Silas asked, his voice soft in the firelight. "I'm thinking about how the town looked at me a year ago," Mara replied. "Like I was already finished, already defeated. Like my story was over, and I was just too stubborn to admit it. And now? Now I'm the woman who helped unite the valley," Mara said, wonder and pride mixing in her voice. "The woman who stood up to power and showed others they could do the same. The woman who built a family from strangers and a community from desperation. That's not a bad legacy for an old widow who was supposed to quietly disappear." Silas pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, the winter wind howled across the valley, but inside there was warmth and safety, and the profound peace that came from knowing you'd fought your battles and emerged not just surviving, but truly living. Mara closed her eyes and let herself drift, secure in the knowledge that tomorrow she'd wake and do the work again, tending the ranch and the cooperative and the family that had become her whole world. The frontier was still hard, winter was still brutal, and challenges would keep coming as long as she drew breath. But she was ready for them. She was Mara Reed, and she'd learned that she was stronger than fear, braver than desperation, and capable of building hope from ashes. The world had tried to write her off as a woman whose time had passed, but she'd rewritten that story into something far more powerful, a testament to resilience, to community, and to the truth that it's never too late to fight for what you love. The baby stirred in his cradle, making the small sounds that meant he'd wake soon, wanting to be fed. Mara rose to tend to him, this unexpected blessing, this symbol of new beginnings in a life she'd thought was winding down. She lifted Thomas into her arms, feeling his solid weight, breathing in the sweet scent of him, and felt her heart expand with a joy she'd earned through suffering and struggle. This was her victory. Not just the ranch saved or the cooperative built, but the life she'd claimed for herself when everyone else had decided it was over. She'd taken the story they'd tried to write for her and torn it up, replacing it with something infinitely more complex and beautiful and true. And as she settled into the rocking chair to feed her son, with Silas banking the fire and the house settling into night around them, Mara understood that some endings were really just beginnings in disguise, and that the most powerful thing a person could do was refuse to accept defeat when the world insisted it was inevitable. She had refused, had fought, had built something lasting from the wreckage of loss, and that, in the end, was enough.